There is a population living in southern Africa today that carries within its genome something no other living human population possesses. Not a disease, not a deficiency, something closer to the opposite, the deepest genetic diversity of any people on Earth, a connection to the oldest continuously surviving branch of the human family tree, a biological record of what humanity looked like before the migrations and mixings and bottlenecks of the last 100,000 years compressed the genetic landscape of our species into something narrower and more uniform than it began. They are the Khoisan, the San, sometimes called Bushmen, and the Khoeko, sometimes called Hottentots by early European colonizers, names imposed without consent and now largely rejected. These are among the most studied and the most misunderstood people in the history of anthropology. For 2 centuries, European observers described them with the full arsenal of colonial condescension: primitive, simple, relics of an earlier stage of human evolution. The very language used to describe them was a measure of how thoroughly the people doing the describing had failed to understand what they were looking at. What they were looking at, though they had no way to know it, was the beginning. Not the beginning of a primitive stage of human development, but the beginning of the human family itself, the oldest branch, the deepest root, the population whose ancestors separated from all other human lineages at a point so early in the history of our species that the divergence predates the migrations that carried Homo sapiens out of Africa and across the world. The Khoisan were never a remnant of something simpler. They were, and are, the living connection to the oldest chapter of the human story that any population on Earth still carries. To understand what the ancient DNA and modern genomics have revealed about the Khoisan, you need to understand what human genetic diversity actually means and why it is not uniformly distributed across our species. Modern humans originated in Africa, and this is not a contested claim. The genetic evidence is overwhelming, consistent, and has been refined over decades into a picture of extraordinary resolution. All living human populations descend from African ancestors, but the timing of the divergences between different lineages and the relative depth of genetic diversity within different populations is not equal across the human family. When geneticists measure genetic diversity within a population, they are essentially measuring how long that population has had to accumulate differences between its members through the normal process of mutation across generations. A population that has been large and continuous for a very long time will have more internal diversity than a population that was founded recently by a small group. The out-of-Africa migration, which carried the ancestors of all non-African populations out of the continent beginning roughly 70,000 years ago, was a bottleneck. A relatively small group of people left Africa, and all the populations of Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania descend from that small founding group. Non-African populations are therefore, as a rule, genetically less diverse than African populations, carrying a subset of the total genetic variation that existed in Africa before the migration. Within Africa itself, however, the pattern of genetic diversity is not uniform either, and this is where the Khoisan story becomes genuinely extraordinary. The San people of southern Africa, based on genomic analysis, conducted across the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and substantially refined by landmark studies in 2012 and 2016, show levels of genetic diversity within their populations that exceed those of virtually any other human group on Earth. More than that, the San lineages diverge from all other human lineages at a point estimated to be somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago, before the out-of-Africa migration, before the divergence of West African from East African populations, before virtually every other major branching event in the modern human family tree. This means something profound, and something that the standard narrative of human origins had not fully accommodated. The Khoisan are not simply African. They are not simply the southernmost representatives of the broader African human population that gave rise to everyone else. They are a lineage that separated from all other human lineages extraordinarily early, that survived in southern Africa through the entire span of modern human prehistory, and that maintained enough population continuity to carry forward genetic diversity that has been lost or compressed in every other human population on Earth. The 2012 study published in the journal Cell, involving genomic analysis of 5 Southern African individuals, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the San elder Juvla Hoansi man known as Gubi, found that the sand showed more genetic difference between individuals within their own group than existed between a European and an Asian. The internal diversity of a single sand community exceeded the diversity between two human populations, separated by 10,000 miles and tens of thousands of years of separate development. This is not a small finding. It is, in its way, one of the most significant genetic results of the 21st century. It means that the genetic variation that all other humans share, the full range of human biological diversity that produced every face, every disease susceptibility, every immune response, every trait that varies across the human species, represents only a subset of the variation that exists within the Khoisan. They are, in this precise sense, more genetically diverse than the rest of humanity combined. What does this mean for the story of human origins? The implications are still being worked out, but several threads are clear. The first is about the geography of early human evolution. The traditional model placed the origin of modern humans in East Africa, specifically in the region around the Omo River, in what is now Ethiopia, based on the oldest Homo sapiens fossils then known. The genetic data complicates this single origin model in ways that are still being actively debated. The deep divergence of the Khoisan lineage, dated to well before the conventional out-of-Africa migration, suggests that southern Africa was not simply a destination reached late by migrations out of an East African origin zone. It was a place where anatomically modern humans, or their immediate ancestors, were living and developing distinct lineages at a time so early that the conventional model had not imagined modern humans there yet. More recent fossil discoveries, including the Florisbad skull from South Africa, dated to approximately 260,000 years ago, and the Homo sapiens idaltu from Ethiopia, dated to 160,000 years ago, have pushed the known range of early modern humans, both geographically and temporally, in ways that are consistent with the genomic picture. The human story in Africa was not a single center of origin from which everyone else dispersed. It was a complex, multi-regional process in which distinct populations were evolving across a large geographic range, with occasional periods of contact and gene flow, for hundreds of thousands of years before any of them left the continent. The Khoisan lineage is the most direct living connection to this earlier, more complex phase of African human prehistory. Their deep divergence is not an anomaly. It is the record of a population that remained in southern Africa, or in the broader southern African region, through the entire span of this early period, accumulating diversity, while the rest of the human world was being shaped by the migrations and bottlenecks that followed. The second implication concerns language. The Khoisan languages, spoken by San and Khoisan communities across Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania, are the only languages in the world that use click consonants as a primary feature of their phonological system. Other languages, including some Bantu languages in southern Africa and the Hadza and Sandawe languages of Tanzania, have borrowed click consonants from Khoisan neighbors, but the click consonants originate in Khoisan languages. They exist nowhere else in the world as a primary original feature. The click consonants of the Khoisan languages are among the most complex sounds produced by any human speech system. They require the simultaneous coordination of multiple articulatory positions in the mouth and throat in ways that take years for adult learners to master. Children raised speaking these languages acquire the clicks naturally, the same way children raised speaking tonal languages develop pitch discrimination that is unavailable to adult learners. The sounds are not primitive, they are extraordinarily sophisticated, and they are, if the genetic deep divergence of the Khoisan is taken seriously, potentially among the oldest sounds in the human linguistic record. We cannot know what the first modern humans sounded like, but the Khoisan languages, carried forward by the deepest genetic lineage on Earth, are the closest thing we have to that oldest language. The history of what happened to the Khoisan over the past several thousand years is a history of one of the most sustained demographic pressures in human prehistory, followed by one of the most brutal colonial encounters in modern history. Beginning around 2,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking agricultural populations began expanding southward from their origin zone in west-central Africa, moving through the forests and savannas of sub-Saharan Africa, and gradually replacing or absorbing the hunter-gatherer populations they encountered. The Khoisan were pushed progressively southward and into increasingly marginal environments. The Kalahari Desert, the Namib, The arid zones where the agricultural package that drove the Bantu expansion did not function as effectively. Their territory shrank, their population declined. Their languages, several dozen distinct tongues within the broader Khoisan family, began to disappear as communities were absorbed or displaced. Then came the Dutch, arriving at the Cape in 1652, followed by the systematic dispossession that would characterize European colonialism across southern Africa for the next 3.5 centuries. The Khoisan were enslaved, killed, driven from their remaining territories, and subjected to a systematic destruction of their way of life that reduced populations that may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands to a fraction of that. By the early 20th century, the surviving San communities were scattered and reduced, their languages endangered, their traditional territories occupied, their children taken to mission schools where the clicks and the ancient sounds were beaten out of them. That they survived at all is not a small thing. Today, approximately 100,000 San people remain, living primarily in Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. Some communities maintain significant elements of traditional hunter-gatherer life. Most live in conditions shaped by the poverty and dispossession that colonialism created, and that subsequent governments have been slow to address. Their land rights remain contested. Their political representation remains marginal. Their languages remain endangered. The Zam language, once spoken across much of South Africa, has had no fluent speakers since the early 20th century. We know it only from the recordings and transcriptions of a 19th century German linguist who spent years documenting what he could of its sounds and stories before they were entirely lost. The genome, however, has not been lost. The genetic diversity that makes the Khoisan the oldest surviving branch of the human family has not been destroyed by colonialism or displacement or the centuries of pressure that preceded it. It is there, in the cells of every San man and woman alive today, as rich and as deep as it ever was. The physical and cultural inheritance has been attacked, diminished, partially destroyed. The biological inheritance is intact. The molecule, as it always does, persisted through everything that was done to the people who carried it. What the genomics of the Khoisan tells us is ultimately not just a story about one people in southern Africa. It is a story about the full depth of the human past. The Khoisan genetic lineage is the oldest branch of the human family tree. Every other human population, every other lineage, every other people who has ever lived on Earth is younger, descended more recently, separated from the common ancestor by a shorter span of time. We are all, in the most precise genomic sense, the Khoisan's younger relatives. Every family has an oldest branch. Ours is still here, still speaking, still carrying in its cells the record of a human past that no other living population has preserved, and still waiting for the world to understand what it has been looking at all along.